In the history of crime, there are names that echo through generations. Bundy, Dahmer, Gacy. Faces we recognize, but stories we never fully understood. They weren't born monsters. They became them, and behind each name lies another and another, a century of killers who turned ordinary lives into nightmares. This is more than a documentary. It's a record of the darkest minds ever known, a catalogue of humanity's most terrifying extremes, 100 murderers, 100 stories, each more disturbing than the last. This is Midnight Minds, 100 Killers, 100 Stories, Volume 1, the first chapter in a series that will take you from America's heartland to the far corners of the world, through decades of fear, obsession, and unimaginable cruelty. Tonight we begin at the dawn of modern evil, with the man who turned charisma into a weapon and murder into myth. Ted Bundy. Born on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Bundy entered the world under circumstances already shrouded in secrecy. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was 22 years old and unmarried, something deeply frowned upon at the time. To avoid scandal, she gave birth in a home for unwed mothers and later returned to her parents' house in Philadelphia. For the first few years of Ted's life, he believed his grandparents were his parents and that his biological mother was actually his sister. That quiet deception would follow him for the rest of his life. Ted's grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was known for his violent temper and was said to be abusive to both animals and people. His grandmother suffered from depression and relied on medication to cope. Inside that house, Bundy's childhood was tense and unpredictable. When Ted was 4, his mother took him to Tacoma, Washington to start over. There she met and married a hospital cook named Johnny Bundy, whose surname Ted would carry. But the new life did little to fill the emotional void. Even as a child, Ted seemed polite and intelligent, but oddly detached. Neighbors later recalled how he would wander the streets at night, peering into windows and collecting knives or discarded items. Looking back, those were the earliest signs of something darker forming beneath the surface. Bundy later admitted that he never truly felt love, not even from his mother, and said that might have been where it all began. By high school, Bundy appeared to be an ambitious, well-groomed, and confident student. Yet underneath the charm, he struggled with identity, anger, and an unsettling fascination with control, especially over women. As Bundy grew older, the mask he had built hardened into armor. Behind it lived a calculating mind that studied people like a hunter studies movement in the dark. His first confirmed killings began in the early 1970s, though many investigators believe his violence started years earlier. Victims vanished from Washington State and Oregon, young women with long dark hair parted in the middle, a detail Bundy seemed fixated on. He often pretended to be injured, wearing a sling or dropping books near his car, relying on kindness to lure victims close. When they bent to help, he struck. Each attack was methodical and rehearsed. He bludgeoned, restrained, and abducted his victims in broad daylight, then drove them to remote forested areas where they were assaulted and murdered. During the summer of 1974, disappearances mounted. College campuses trembled with fear, yet Bundy moved freely through them, volunteering at a crisis line center and answering calls from women terrified of the killer who unknowingly was the man taking their calls. That July, he approached 2 women on the same day at Lake Sammamish State Park, introducing himself by name, Ted. Both vanished. Witnesses later described his brown Volkswagen Beetle, its passenger seat removed to make space for bodies. When Bundy moved to Utah later that year to attend law school, the killings followed. Women vanished from Salt Lake City, Idaho, and Colorado. Police across several states began connecting the dots, a trail of disappearances stretching across the American Northwest. In 1975, a patrol officer stopped Bundy's car. Inside were handcuffs, a ski mask, a crowbar, and rope. They looked like burglary tools, but investigators soon realized their true purpose. Bundy was arrested later that year on kidnapping charges. Yet even in custody, he remained calm and confident. He studied law, defended himself, and charmed reporters. But as evidence surfaced, teeth impressions, eyewitness accounts, and the Volkswagen link, the illusion began to break. Then came the escapes. Twice. In 1977, Bundy jumped from a courthouse window during a pre-trial hearing and vanished for 6 days. Later that same year, he slipped through a hole cut in his cell ceiling and disappeared again, this time for weeks. He resurfaced in Florida, and what followed would be his most brutal spree. On January 15, 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Within minutes, 2 women were dead and 2 more seriously injured. Soon after, he murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. By February, a routine traffic stop ended the hunt. When officers pulled him over, Bundy resisted, then smiled and said, "I guess you got me." Once Bundy was in custody, the evidence piled up. Fingerprints, vehicle records, and dental impressions tied him to multiple murders. Still, he denied everything, speaking with the same calm charm that had once deceived so many. Florida authorities charged him with the Chi Omega murders. His trial became one of America's first televised true crime spectacles. Bundy dismissed his lawyers and acted as his own attorney, cross-examining witnesses and smiling for the cameras as if it were a performance. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bite mark photos matched his teeth exactly. Witnesses placed him near the crime scenes, and stolen items were found among his possessions. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, Bundy showed no emotion. He later faced a second trial for the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Again, the result was the same: guilty, sentenced to death. For 9 years, Bundy lived on Florida's death row, filing appeals and giving interviews that mixed confession with manipulation. Eventually, he admitted to killing more than 30 women across several states, though investigators believe the real number was much higher. In his final days, Bundy tried to shift blame, pointing to pornography, upbringing, and society, but his words rang hollow. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m., the current surged through the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, crowds cheered as the news broke. The life of Theodore Robert Bundy had come to an end. Even now, his name lingers in the shadows of American crime, a reminder that true evil can look ordinary, speak softly, and smile while it destroys. As Ted Bundy's name began to fade from the headlines, another predator was quietly emerging in the American Midwest. Where Bundy sought control, this man sought possession, a need so twisted that even death itself wasn't enough to satisfy it. His name was Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From the outside, his childhood seemed ordinary. His father, Lionel, was a chemist. His mother, Joyce, struggled with anxiety and depression. But behind the family's suburban facade, things were far from normal. Arguments were constant, and Dahmer grew up withdrawn and lonely. From a young age, he developed an obsession with dead animals. He would collect roadkill, dissect the remains, and store bones in jars. When asked why, he claimed curiosity. He wanted to see what was inside. His father, a scientist, assumed it was innocent fascination, and even showed him how to preserve bones with bleach. That encouragement, though well-meant, only deepened his fixation. In high school, Dahmer was a quiet but troubled teenager. He drank heavily, sometimes sneaking alcohol into class. Teachers described him as polite but distracted, while classmates remembered strange pranks, mocking seizures, bizarre noises, and erratic behavior. By graduation, his parents' marriage had fallen apart, and Dahmer was left alone in the family home. It was there, in 1978, that he claimed his first victim. A hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks accepted a ride to Dahmer's house for a few beers. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer struck him with a dumbbell, strangled him, and dismembered the body. He buried the remains in the backyard, later crushing the bones to hide the evidence. He was 18 years old. For several years after that first killing, Dahmer lived quietly, drifting between jobs and struggling with alcohol addiction. He joined the army, but was discharged after 2 years for excessive drinking. Eventually, he returned to Milwaukee, where his urges began to resurface. In 1987, he murdered again, this time a man he met at a bar named Stephen Twomey. Dahmer claimed he woke up next to the body with no memory of the killing, but rather than panic, he began experimenting. He bought a suitcase, dismembered the corpse, and disposed of it in a hotel dumpster. Soon the pattern repeated. Over the next 5 years, Dahmer's crimes escalated with disturbing precision. He lured men, often young and vulnerable, back to his apartment with promises of money or photographs. Once there, he drugged and strangled them. But unlike most killers, Dahmer wasn't satisfied with death. He posed the bodies, took photographs, and performed acts of necrophilia. Eventually, he began preserving body parts, skulls, bones, even entire torsos, keeping them as trophies. By 1991, neighbors in his Milwaukee apartment building were complaining about the foul smell. Dahmer told them it was spoiled meat. Inside his small apartment, police would later discover a nightmare. Human skulls arranged in the refrigerator, a barrel of acid filled with dissolving flesh, and a shrine he was building from bones and painted skulls. The horror ended by accident. On July 22, 1991, a man named Tracy Edwards escaped from Dahmer's apartment, running through the streets in handcuffs. When police followed him back, they uncovered what became one of the most shocking crime scenes in American history. Dahmer calmly admitted to everything. He described each murder in chilling detail, explaining that he had wanted to create a permanent companion, someone who could never leave. During interviews, he spoke without emotion, saying he knew what he did was wrong, but felt powerless to stop. He was charged with 17 counts of murder. In 1992, Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. At trial, he expressed remorse, but showed little understanding of why he did it. He was placed in a Wisconsin state prison, where he seemed resigned to his fate. 2 years later, on November 28, 1994, another inmate named Christopher Scarver attacked Dahmer and another prisoner during a work detail. Both men were bludgeoned to death. Dahmer died instantly at age 34. Even in death, the story of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the most disturbing in criminal history. A man who turned his loneliness into horror and transformed his apartment into a museum of death. But as the public struggled to comprehend his crimes, another killer was already operating in the shadows. One who would hide his brutality behind the mask of laughter and a painted smile. His name was John Wayne Gacy. As Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes horrified America, another monster had already earned his place in the nation's nightmares. While Dahmer's evil hid behind shyness, this man hid his behind a smile, a clown's painted grin that entertained children by day and concealed death by night. His name was John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the only son among 3 children in a working-class family. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was an auto repair machinist and a heavy drinker, known for his violent temper. His mother, Marion, was caring but powerless against her husband's rage. As a boy, Gacy was often beaten by his father, who called him weak and worthless. The abuse left him craving approval from authority figures while secretly resenting them. He also suffered from health issues, including blackouts and a heart condition, which made him an outcast among his peers. Despite this, Gacy tried to appear normal. He became active in community projects and political groups, even volunteering for the local Democratic Party. By his early 20s, he'd married his first wife, Marlynn Myers, and worked as a manager for Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants owned by her family in Iowa. To neighbors, he was a friendly young businessman with a bright future. But behind closed doors, Gacy's darker impulses were emerging. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. His wife divorced him, and his children never saw him again. Yet Gacy served only 18 months before being released for good behavior. After leaving prison, he returned to Chicago to rebuild his life. He started a construction business and began performing at children's hospitals and charity events as Pogo the Clown. The colorful costume, makeup, and oversized smile became his disguise. Gacy said the clown persona gave him freedom. No one suspects the clown. Through the 1970s, Gacy became a respected local figure. He hosted neighborhood parties, met with politicians, and presented himself as a model citizen. But at night, he preyed on young men and teenage boys, often luring them to his home with promises of work, money, or drugs. Once inside, he handcuffed them, assaulted them, and strangled them to death. He buried many of his victims beneath the floorboards of his house on Summerdale Avenue. Others were dumped in nearby rivers. For years, police failed to connect the disappearances, even as Gacy's list of victims grew. In December 1978, Gacy made a fatal mistake. A teenage boy named Robert Peace disappeared after telling his mother he was going to speak with Gacy about a job. When police searched Gacy's home, the smell of decay was overwhelming. Investigators soon discovered a crawl space filled with bodies. Over the following days, the truth emerged. 29 victims were buried beneath his house, and several others had been thrown into the Des Plaines River. The sheer scale of his crimes stunned the nation. Gacy was arrested on December 21, 1978, and confessed to the murders in chilling detail. He described his acts with no remorse, claiming he had been possessed by an alternate persona, not John Gacy the businessman, but the clown. In 1980, he was convicted of 33 counts of murder and sentenced to death. During his years on death row, Gacy painted portraits of clowns, Jesus, and himself, works that became infamous among collectors. He continued to maintain his innocence, claiming he had been framed. On May 10, 1994, after 14 years of appeals, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final words were, "Kiss my ass." Even in death, Gacy's story continues to haunt American culture, a reminder that evil can wear the face of a neighbor, a friend, or even a clown making children laugh. But Gacy was only one face in a gallery of killers that stretched far beyond Chicago. From coast to coast, another predator was already on the hunt, one who would leave the Pacific Northwest stained with fear. His name was Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. After John Wayne Gacy's execution, America hoped it had seen the last of its monsters. But even as the news faded, another predator was quietly at work. One who would become the most prolific serial killer in US history. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway, known to the world as the Green River Killer. Gary Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He grew up in a troubled household in Seattle's working-class suburbs. His father was a bus driver who often complained about prostitutes he saw on his routes. His mother was described as overbearing and volatile. Ridgway's relationship with her would later be seen as a source of deep psychological conflict. As a child, Ridgway struggled in school and was known for erratic behavior. He performed poorly academically and was teased by classmates for his awkward manner. At age 16, he committed his first violent act, stabbing a 6-year-old boy. The child survived, and Ridgway later claimed he attacked him just to see how it felt. After high school, Ridgway joined the Navy and served in Vietnam. When he returned home, he worked as a truck painter in Seattle and married 3 times. To those who knew him, he seemed like a quiet, hard-working man. But inside, he was already at war with himself, obsessed with sex, anger, and control. In the early 1980s, the bodies began to appear. Women, most of them sex workers or runaways, were found strangled and dumped near the Green River in Washington state. The killer would sometimes return to the bodies, moving them or performing disturbing acts with the remains. The pattern was clear, but the man behind it stayed invisible. The killings continued for years. Police formed the Green River Task Force, one of the largest investigations in American history. The media compared the case to Jack the Ripper. Dozens of detectives chased leads, interviewed suspects, and even consulted the notorious Ted Bundy, who offered insight into how a killer like Ridgway might think. Despite their efforts, the murders kept coming. Ridgway blended perfectly into ordinary life. He attended church regularly, read the Bible, and volunteered in his community. He often picked up sex workers in his truck, then strangled them and left their bodies in wooded areas or rivers. For nearly 2 decades, he evaded capture. By the time investigators connected the DNA evidence, Ridgway had killed at least 48 women, possibly more than 70. When he was finally arrested in 2001, he confessed with chilling simplicity. "I killed so many women," he said. "I can't remember all their names." He told police he had targeted prostitutes because he thought no one would miss them. He wanted to rid the world of what he called filth, even as he profited from their trust. His calm, emotionless tone during questioning left detectives stunned. In 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder to avoid the death penalty. In return, he helped authorities locate the remains of his victims. During sentencing, He sat expressionless as family members spoke of their loss. When asked why he did it, Ridgway offered no real answer, only that killing had become a habit. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole and remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary. Even behind bars, the true number of his victims remains uncertain. Gary Ridgway's crimes left a permanent scar on the Pacific Northwest. His story exposed the hidden dangers of indifference. How a man who looked ordinary, who worked, prayed, and smiled at his neighbors, could also be one of the deadliest killers in history. But as Ridgway's life faded into the prison system, another killer was already making headlines, one whose crimes were so shocking they would redefine the word evil. His name was Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. As Gary Ridgway sat behind bars, another name was already etched into the dark history of American crime. This one wasn't known for chaos or frenzy, but for patience. A man who planned, stalked, and documented every murder like an obsessive archivist. He called himself BTK, an acronym for Bind, Torture, Kill. His real name was Dennis Lynn Rader. Dennis Rader was born on March 9, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and raised in Wichita. To neighbors, he seemed like an ordinary Midwestern man. He was polite, reliable, and worked as a compliance officer for the city. He served in the Air Force, married young, had 2 children, and attended church every Sunday. He even led the local Cub Scout troop. No one could have guessed that the man helping his neighbors fix their bins was also writing about his fantasies of murder in private notebooks. From childhood, Rader displayed disturbing tendencies. He tortured animals and developed a fascination with bondage and control. As an adult, those urges evolved into detailed fantasies that consumed him. By the early 1970s, he decided to make those fantasies real. On January 15, 1974, Rader broke into the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Inside were 4 people, Joseph and Julie Otero, and their 2 children, Joseph Jr. and Josie. Rader tied them up one by one and strangled them to death. When police arrived, they found a scene of calculated brutality. The killer left behind no real evidence, only a signature of control and precision that would later define his crimes. In the months that followed, Rader killed again, always choosing victims who fit his fantasies of dominance. He wrote taunting letters to the police and media, describing the murders in graphic detail and signing them BTK. Those letters revealed his twisted sense of pride. He wanted fame, credit, and recognition. "How many people do I have to kill," he once wrote, "before I get a name in the paper?" Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, BTK struck repeatedly. His victims were women and families chosen at random. Each murder followed a ritual: breaking in, binding, torture, and finally strangulation. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. For over a decade, BTK went silent. The case went cold. Some detectives believed he was dead or imprisoned. But in reality, Dennis Rader had simply grown bored and stopped, content to live a normal life while keeping his secret buried inside him. He worked as a dog catcher, enforced neighborhood codes, and became president of his church council. He lived quietly with his wife and children in the same city where his victims once lived. He even stood next to detectives who had hunted him for years without knowing who he was. Then, in 2004, after nearly 25 years of silence, Rader resurfaced. He sent a floppy disk to a local news station, bragging about his past crimes. What he didn't know was that the disk contained hidden data that traced back to a computer registered to Christ Lutheran Church, where Rader was president. Police quickly closed in. They matched DNA from one of his daughter's medical records to evidence from the BTK crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested while driving home from work. When confronted, he confessed almost immediately. Over several interviews, Rader described every murder in chilling, matter-of-fact detail. He showed no remorse, only disappointment that he had been caught. He even referred to his victims as projects. In court, Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. His confession stunned the courtroom, not just for its detail, but for his calm delivery. He received 10 consecutive life sentences with no chance of parole. Today, Dennis Rader remains in solitary confinement at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He spends his days writing letters and reflecting on his crimes, still referring to himself as BTK, a reminder that even in captivity, he refuses to let go of the monster he created. His story is one of control and ego, a warning that the darkest minds don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they live right next door. But while Raiders' capture closed one chapter of fear, another was already opening. One that would bring terror to New York City, delivered through handwritten letters and bullets fired in the night. His name was David Berkowitz, but the world would know him as the son of Sam. David Richard Berkowitz was born Richard David Falco on June 1, 1953 in Brooklyn, New York. His birth mother gave him up for adoption soon after he was born, and he was raised by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a working-class couple in the Bronx. They gave him a stable home, but from an early age, David struggled with feelings of abandonment and resentment. He was intelligent, but restless and easily angered. Teachers remembered him as disruptive and withdrawn. When his adoptive mother died of cancer, he was devastated. His father soon remarried and moved away, leaving Berkowitz increasingly isolated. After high school, he joined the US Army and served in South Korea. By the time he returned to New York in the early 1970s, he was directionless, drifting through low-paying jobs and cheap apartments, nursing a growing obsession with violence. In 1975, Berkowitz claimed he began hearing voices, whispering commands from demons. He later said a neighbor's dog was possessed by a spirit that told him to kill. Whether these delusions were real to him or a convenient excuse, no one can say for certain. What's clear is that by the summer of 1976, his fantasies had become real. On July 29, 1976, Berkowitz attacked two young women sitting in a parked car in the Bronx, shooting them with a .44 caliber revolver. One was killed instantly, the other was gravely wounded. Over the following year, similar shootings spread across New York's boroughs. The victims were usually couples, ambushed late at night as they sat in cars or walked home together. The city was gripped by panic. Newspapers called him the .44 caliber killer. Women cut their hair short or dyed it blonde after reports suggested he targeted brunettes. Bars and nightclubs emptied early. New York's nightlife, its heartbeat, came to a standstill. Then, in April 1977, a letter arrived at a crime scene addressed to the police captain. It was signed, Son of Sam. In it, Berkowitz mocked investigators and declared himself the servant of a demonic master. His rambling words mixed biblical imagery with madness, creating the public persona that would terrify the city for months. By summer, police had hundreds of officers working the case. They tracked car registrations, interviewed witnesses, and followed thousands of tips. Then, on August 10, 1977, they got their break. A woman in Yonkers reported that her neighbor, David Berkowitz, had been acting strangely, and that his car had been ticketed near one of the crime scenes. When detectives arrived at his apartment, Berkowitz greeted them with a chilling calm. "Well," he said, "you got me." In his car, they found a .44 revolver, maps, and another letter intended for the police. During interrogation, Berkowitz confessed immediately. He claimed he was commanded by a demon named Sam, who lived in the body of his neighbor's dog. The story was so bizarre that police initially thought he was mocking them. But his knowledge of the crimes left no doubt. He was the killer. In 1978, David Berkowitz pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder and received 6 consecutive life sentences. He later recanted his story about the demon, admitting that he had invented it to appear insane. Over the years, he became a born-again Christian and now refers to himself as the Son of Hope. He remains imprisoned in New York, where he has repeatedly declined parole, saying he deserves to stay behind bars. For the people of New York, the memory of those nights still lingers. The fear of the unseen gunman who struck without warning, turning one of the world's most vibrant cities into a place of silence and dread. But as Berkowitz's crimes faded into history, another killer was beginning his own reign of terror, one who targeted women across the Midwest, leaving bodies beside highways and rivers. His name was Ted Bundy's successor in cruelty, Henry Lee Lucas. Henry Lee Lucas, the confession killer. As New York City began to recover from the terror of the Son of Sam, another killer was roaming the backroads of America. A drifter whose story would become one of the strangest and most controversial in criminal history. His name was Henry Lee Lucas, and for years the world couldn't decide if he was a monster or a liar. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in a one-room cabin in Blacksburg, Virginia. His childhood was a nightmare of abuse and neglect. His father, Anderson, was an alcoholic with both legs amputated who made money selling pencils on the street. His mother, Viola, was a violent sex worker who forced Henry to watch her with clients and often beat him for no reason. By the age of 10, Henry had already suffered multiple head injuries and had been taught nothing of compassion or morality. At 13, he committed his first known act of violence, stabbing a classmate during a fight. His mother responded by beating him nearly unconscious. At 17, Lucas ran away from home and began drifting across the country. In 1951, he was arrested for burglary and served time in prison. After his release, he drifted again, stealing cars, taking odd jobs, and eventually returning home to face his mother one last time. In 1960, during an argument, Viola Lucas struck her son with a broom. He retaliated by stabbing her in the neck, killing her instantly. He later claimed he didn't mean to kill her, only to make her stop yelling. Lucas was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to prison, where he served 10 years before being paroled. After his release, he moved restlessly between states, working as a roofer, mechanic, and laborer. He soon met Otis Toole, another drifter with a dark reputation, and the two began traveling together. They developed a twisted partnership based on crime, manipulation, and murder. In 1983, Lucas was arrested for unlawful possession of a firearm. Once in custody, he began talking, and once he started, he didn't stop. Over the following months, he confessed to hundreds of murders across the United States. Some were believable, many were not. Police from dozens of states arrived to interview him. He described victims, dates, and locations with apparent precision. He even claimed involvement in high-profile, unsolved cases. Newspapers called him the confession killer, but as investigators compared his stories with real evidence, cracks began to show. Lucas would confess to crimes committed, while he was proven to be hundreds of miles away. He described victims who didn't exist, towns that weren't on the map, and dates that made no sense. Yet for a time, authorities believed him. His cooperation helped police close more than 200 cold cases, many of which would later be reopened and dismissed. Behind the scenes, some detectives began to suspect that Lucas was manipulating them for attention, food, and privileges. He received better meals, cigarettes, and constant company from visiting officers. In his own words, he enjoyed playing them all like a fiddle. Eventually, the truth came out. DNA evidence and witness records cleared Lucas of many of the murders he had confessed to. Still, there was no doubt he had killed, at least a few times, including his mother and several others confirmed by physical evidence. In 1984, he was convicted of the murder of an unidentified woman known only as Orange Socks, whose body had been found near Georgetown, Texas. He was sentenced to death, but as more evidence surfaced showing he couldn't have committed many of the crimes he claimed, his death sentence was commuted to life in prison. Henry Lee Lucas died in 2001 of heart failure at the age of 64. To this day, no one knows exactly how many people he killed. Some say 3, others believe as many as 11, far from the hundreds he once boasted. In the end, Lucas became infamous not only for his crimes but for his lies. His story blurred the line between confession and deception, leaving behind a legacy of chaos that forced investigators to question their own judgment. But as the debate over Lucas's guilt faded, another killer stepped into the light. One who didn't just lie about his murders, but documented them in detail, treating each one as a personal masterpiece. His name was Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer. As Henry Lee Lucas spun tales of murder and deception, far more disturbing truths were already written into the life of another man, one whose crimes were not only real but methodically planned, each more horrifying than the last. He wasn't a drifter or a con artist. He was calm, intelligent, and chillingly articulate. His name was Edmund Emil Kemper, the man the press would call the co-ed killer. Edmund Kemper was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California. He was the middle child of Clarnell and Edmund Kemper Sr. His father was a World War II veteran who later worked as an electrician, while his mother was controlling and emotionally abusive. From the beginning, their relationship was toxic. Clarnell frequently belittled her son, calling him useless and comparing him unfavorably to his sisters. She forced him to sleep in the basement away from the rest of the family, fearing he might harm his siblings. By the age of 10, Edmund's fascination with death had already begun. He decapitated his sister's dolls, buried family pets alive, and once said he dreamed of killing his mother. He was tall, quiet, and intelligent, but completely detached from empathy. At 15, after years of escalating violence and resentment, he acted on his impulses. He took his grandparents' rifle, shot his grandmother in the kitchen, and then killed his grandfather when he returned home. When questioned, Edmund said he just wanted to see what it felt like. He was sent to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. Inside, doctors noted his intelligence, his IQ tested at 145, and described him as polite, cooperative, and deeply disturbed. He learned how to mimic psychiatric behavior, studying the very doctors assigned to treat him. At 21, he was released back into his mother's custody, despite their volatile history. For a time, he tried to live a normal life. He found work with the California Highway Department and often socialized with local police officers who nicknamed him Big Ed because of his size, 6'9" and nearly 300 pounds. What none of them realized was that Big Ed was beginning to hunt again. Between 1972 and 1973, Kemper picked up female hitchhikers across Santa Cruz and Monterey County, college students looking for rides along the California coast. He would drive them to remote areas, kill them, and then take their bodies home. What he did next was beyond comprehension. He dismembered the victims, performed acts of necrophilia, and buried body parts in his mother's garden. Kemper became skilled at deception. He used his knowledge of police behavior to avoid suspicion and even discussed the ongoing investigation with officers at a local bar. As bodies continued to appear, locals began calling the unknown murderer the co-ed killer. By April 1973, Kemper's rage turned inward, toward the one person he had hated his entire life. He killed his mother in her sleep, striking her with a hammer and decapitating her. Afterward, he mutilated her body and used her severed head as a prop in one final grotesque display of power. He later killed his mother's best friend, as if closing the chapter of his lifelong hatred once and for all. Days later, Kemper fled California. But instead of hiding, he drove straight to Colorado and called the police from a payphone to confess. At first, they didn't believe him. They knew him as the polite, intelligent man who drank coffee with them. But when he gave precise details only the killer could know, they realized the truth. At trial, Edmund Kemper showed no emotion. He described his murders calmly, explaining his motives with a detached intelligence that horrified even experienced investigators. He was found guilty of 8 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Today, he remains incarcerated at California Medical Facility, where he has become one of the most studied serial killers in history. Kemper reads books for the blind and has granted interviews that reveal a disturbing self-awareness. He once said, "When I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think 2 things. One part of me wants to take her out, talk to her, be kind. The other wonders what her head would look like on a stick." Edmund Kemper's story isn't just about murder. It's about intelligence without empathy, proof that brilliance can be just as dangerous as madness. But even as Kemper sat behind bars, another killer was writing his own chapter in blood. One who would turn the peaceful hills of California's wine country into a hunting ground for couples in love. His name was David Carpenter, the Trailside Killer. As Edmund Kemper sat in prison recounting his gruesome confessions, the peace of Northern California was once again under threat. A new killer was stalking the same region, one who hunted along sunlit trails and quiet forest paths where couples went to escape city life. His name was David Joseph Carpenter, the man who would become known as the Trailside Killer. Ding Dua. David Carpenter was born on May 6, 1930 in San Francisco, California. His childhood was strict and deeply unhappy. His father was distant, and his mother was domineering, known for her constant criticism and unpredictable anger. Carpenter developed a stutter early in life, and his mother's harsh discipline made it worse. He grew up withdrawn, shy, and deeply resentful of women. From a young age, Carpenter showed troubling behavior. He was fascinated by weapons, often bringing knives to school, and by his teenage years he began committing petty crimes. He served short stints in juvenile facilities for theft and assault. By adulthood, his antisocial tendencies had become deeply ingrained. In the 1960s, Carpenter was arrested for attacking a woman with a hammer and served 7 years in prison. After his release, he tried to rebuild his life, working various jobs and pretending to be reformed. But beneath the surface, his rage and resentment toward women only grew stronger. In 1979, he began his killing spree. His first known victim was a 23-year-old woman named Mary Frances Bennett, who was jogging along a San Francisco trail. Her body was found brutally beaten and stabbed. Over the next 2 years, more women disappeared from hiking trails, stretching from Marin County to Santa Cruz. The pattern became unmistakable. The killer targeted women walking or running alone. Some were shot, others stabbed or sexually assaulted, and their bodies were left hidden in wooded areas. Newspapers warned hikers to avoid going out alone, and fear spread through California's parks and beaches. Carpenter's method was always the same. He carried a handgun and sometimes a knife, attacking swiftly and without hesitation. He often arranged the victims' bodies or covered their faces, a small, twisted sign of guilt that investigators would later come to recognize as part of his ritual. In 1980, Carpenter escalated. He began targeting couples, ambushing them on remote trails, killing the men, and assaulting the women. His attacks were so sudden that survivors were rare. But one woman, Ellen Hansen, managed to provide a description before she died, helping police piece together his profile. The case broke open when another victim, a young woman named Heather Skaggs, vanished after telling friends she was meeting Carpenter for a job interview. When her body was found, police traced the connection back to him. In 1981, investigators searched Carpenter's home and found the murder weapon, a .38 caliber revolver, along with maps marking the trail locations where the killings had occurred. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, assault, and attempted rape. During his trial, Carpenter appeared calm and emotionless, denying responsibility despite overwhelming evidence. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Additional trials for murders in other counties brought further convictions. Today, David Carpenter remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, one of California's oldest inmates. He has never shown remorse for his crimes. The Trailside Killer's reign of terror left the people of Northern California fearful of their own parks and beaches, places once meant for peace and freedom, now tainted by horror. But while Carpenter's killings ended, another murderer was already making headlines. A drifter from Texas whose charm and brutality would make him one of America's most infamous predators. His name was Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. As David Carpenter's capture brought a fragile calm to California, the darkness soon returned, this time under the cover of night. From 1984 to 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by fear as a new predator prowled the city's homes, killing without pattern or mercy. He was dubbed the Night Stalker. His real name was Richard Ramirez. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father was a strict laborer with a violent temper. As a boy, Richard was quiet, nervous, and drawn to the macabre. He suffered repeated head injuries and began having seizures as a child. By his early teens, he had turned to drugs and developed an obsession with Satanism. Ramirez was heavily influenced by his older cousin Miguel, a Vietnam veteran who showed him photographs of women he claimed to have tortured and killed during the war. When Richard was just 13, he watched Miguel shoot his wife in the face during an argument. That single act witnessed up close would mark him forever. By 17, Ramirez had dropped out of school, drifted to California, and begun committing burglaries. He slept in bus stations, stole cars, and experimented with cocaine and LSD. He idolized serial killers like Jack the Ripper and saw himself as a disciple of evil. In 1984, his crimes escalated. His first known murder was Jenny Vinkow, a 79-year-old woman found brutally stabbed and mutilated in her Los Angeles apartment. Her throat was slashed, and police discovered evidence of sexual assault. The brutality was shocking, but no one yet knew it was the beginning of a reign of terror. Over the following year, Ramirez broke into homes across Los Angeles and San Francisco, attacking men, women, and even children. His victims ranged in age from 6 to 84. He used a variety of weapons: knives, guns, cords, even hammers, showing no pattern other than cruelty. He often drew pentagrams on walls and on the bodies of his victims, declaring his allegiance to Satan. What made the Night Stalker unique was his unpredictability. He struck in wealthy suburbs and poor neighborhoods alike, killing in one city, then vanishing for weeks before resurfacing miles away. His victims were strangled, shot, or bludgeoned. Survivors described him as tall, gaunt, with decaying teeth and wild, staring eyes. Police had no composite sketch that seemed to fit him, until one lucky fingerprint changed everything. In August 1985, Ramirez entered the home of Bill and Inez Erickson in Mission Viejo. He assaulted Inez but fled when her husband fought back. Witnesses saw his car and recorded the license plate. Within days, detectives traced it to Ramirez. When his mugshot from a previous arrest was released to the public, his face was everywhere. Newspapers, television, posters on street corners. On August 31, 1985, Ramirez tried to steal a car in East Los Angeles, unaware that his photo had already gone viral across the city. Locals recognized him immediately. As he fled through the streets, residents chased and cornered him, beating him until police arrived. At trial, Ramirez was defiant. He smiled, flashed a pentagram carved into his hand, and shouted, "Hail Satan!" His lack of remorse and open worship of evil made him one of the most reviled killers in American history. He was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, and numerous counts of burglary and sexual assault. In 1989, he was sentenced to death. When the verdict was read, he responded with chilling indifference, saying, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory." For decades, Ramirez remained on death row at San Quentin State Prison. He married a fan who had written to him, gave interviews about Satanism, and maintained a cult following among those drawn to darkness. On June 7, 2013, before his execution could be carried out, Richard Ramirez died of cancer at the age of 53. Even in death, his legacy remains, a shadow cast over California, a reminder of how easily evil can hide behind the ordinary. But while Ramirez brought terror to Los Angeles, another killer was stalking the same region, one who hunted not for blood, but for companionship twisted into obsession. His name was Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. While Richard Ramirez terrorized Los Angeles with random violence, another man was stalking the same region with a different weapon: charm. He was handsome, intelligent, and well-spoken, the kind of man who could disarm anyone with a smile. But behind that smile hid a predator, who photographed his victims before taking their lives. His name was Rodney Alcala, remembered now as the dating game killer. Rodney James Alcala was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas. His father abandoned the family when Rodney was still a child, leaving his mother to raise him and his sisters alone. When he was 11, the family moved to Los Angeles, where Alcala excelled academically but showed early signs of narcissism and manipulation. At 17, he joined the US Army and trained as a clerk. However, in 1964, he suffered what military psychiatrists described as a nervous breakdown after being caught attempting to lure a young boy. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and discharged. After leaving the Army, Alcala attended UCLA and studied film. He quickly developed a reputation for being charming yet unsettling, someone who always seemed to be performing. That performance turned deadly in 1968 when he lured an 8-year-old girl into his apartment in Los Angeles and brutally assaulted her. The girl survived, but Alcala fled, escaping to New York under a fake name. In New York, he enrolled at New York University, claiming to be a photographer and film student. He charmed his way into social circles, taking hundreds of portraits of women and children. In 1971, he was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list after being linked to the California assault. An alert witness recognized him, leading to his arrest. Alcala was convicted of the earlier assault, but served only a few years before being released for good behavior. What followed was a series of murders that would stretch through the 1970s. His victims were mostly young women and teenage girls, many of whom he approached on the street or at the beach, offering to take professional photographs. He often posed them for pictures before killing them, creating a haunting collection of images that investigators later found in his storage locker. More than 1,000 photographs, many still unidentified. Between 1977 and 1979, several women were found strangled and assaulted across California. Each case bore the same signs of sadistic control and cruelty. One victim, a 12-year-old girl named Robin Samso, was kidnapped while riding her bike to ballet class. Her remains were discovered in the mountains days later. The investigation finally led police to Alcala. When detectives searched his home, they found jewelry belonging to several victims and hundreds of photographs of unknown women. Alcala was arrested and charged with multiple murders. Then came the moment that would immortalize him in popular culture. In 1978, between his known murders, Alcala appeared as a contestant on the television show The Dating Game. On camera, he introduced himself as a successful photographer who likes skydiving and motorcycles. Charming and confident, he won the episode, but the woman who selected him later refused the date, saying he gave her a creepy feeling. At trial, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: hair samples, photos, and witness accounts linking him to multiple killings. Alcala acted as his own attorney, cross-examining witnesses and even questioning himself on the stand. A chilling performance that shocked the courtroom. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1980, but the verdict was overturned on appeal. He was retried and convicted again in 1986, only for that verdict to be overturned as well due to technical errors. Finally, in 2010, DNA evidence connected him to 4 additional murders, and a third trial resulted in his final conviction and death sentence. In total, Rodney Alcala was linked to at least 7 confirmed murders, though investigators believe the true number may exceed 100. He spent more than a decade on California's death row, never expressing remorse. His collection of photographs remains a chilling legacy. Hundreds of faces, some still unidentified, staring silently from the past. Rodney Alcala died of natural causes in July 2021 at the age of 77. His death brought an end to one of the most manipulative and disturbing cases in American criminal history. A killer who used charm as his disguise and the camera as his weapon. But while Alcala's story ended in silence, another was already unfolding, this time in the Midwest, where a man's thirst for control and manipulation would reach terrifying new heights. His name was John Edward Robinson, and he would become known as the internet's first serial killer. While most killers relied on charm or brute force, this man used computers and online chat rooms, blending manipulation with modern deceit. John Edward Robinson was born on December 27, 1943, in Cicero, Illinois. He grew up in a strict Catholic household. His father was an alcoholic, and his mother was controlling, creating an environment that shaped Robinson's lifelong desire for power and control. He attended a seminary for a time, intending to become a priest, but was expelled for disciplinary problems. Later, he studied medical technology, though he never completed his degree. On the surface, Robinson's life appeared successful. He married, had children, and worked a series of administrative and managerial jobs. But behind his professional image, he was a con artist, forging checks, stealing money, and manipulating anyone who trusted him. By the 1970s, he had already been arrested several times for fraud and embezzlement, yet somehow always managed to talk his way back into respectable circles. In the early 1980s, Robinson began to exploit vulnerable women. He presented himself as a businessman, offering jobs, training, or shelter to single mothers. Several women accepted his offers and vanished without a trace. As the decades passed, Robinson's methods evolved. By the late 1990s, he discovered a new hunting ground: the internet. Using online chat rooms and BDSM forums, he created multiple fake identities, posing as a wealthy professional named Slave Master. He lured women with promises of romance, work, or adventure, often convincing them to move across the country to meet him. In 1999, a woman named Suzette Truton from Michigan agreed to travel to Kansas to work as Robinson's personal assistant. She was never seen again. Robinson told her family she had run off to Europe, an excuse he would use more than once. When police began investigating his activities, they found a trail of missing women who had all last been in contact with Robinson. In 2000, they searched his farm in La Signa, Kansas. What they discovered was horrifying. Inside a metal storage barrel were the bodies of Suzette Troughton and another woman, Isabella Lewica. 2 more barrels were later found at a nearby storage unit he had rented, each containing human remains. Robinson was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and fraud. During interrogation, he remained calm and smug, claiming he was innocent despite overwhelming evidence. Investigators uncovered documents, forged letters, and online messages proving he had manipulated his victims using the anonymity of the internet. In 2002, Robinson was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to death in Kansas. Later, he received additional life sentences in Missouri for other confirmed killings. Prosecutors believed he was responsible for at least 8 murders, though the true number may never be known. Robinson's case made history. He was one of the first serial killers to use computers and online communication as tools of control, turning digital anonymity into a weapon. His crimes changed how law enforcement approached internet safety and online investigations, serving as a grim warning for the digital age. Today, John Edward Robinson remains on death row at El Dorado Correctional Facility. He continues to deny his guilt, despite the evidence that linked him to the bodies, the storage barrels, and the countless online personas he used to deceive his victims. His story marks a turning point in the history of murder, a bridge between old-fashioned predation and the emerging age of technology. And while Robinson hunted from behind a computer screen, another killer, quieter, older, and far more disciplined, was stalking his victims in the shadows of ordinary life. His name was Albert DeSalvo, better known as the Boston Strangler. As John Edward Robinson hunted victims through the internet, another killer decades earlier had terrorized Boston in a time before computers, before digital trails, when fear spread only by newspaper headlines and whispers. His crimes would define an era of paranoia and create one of the most debated cases in American history. His name was Albert Henry DeSalvo, but to the world he was known as the Boston Strangler. Albert DeSalvo was born on September 3, 1931, in Chelsea, Massachusetts. His father was a violent alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and children. Growing up in poverty, DeSalvo learned early how to manipulate and deceive to get what he wanted. He was arrested for theft at the age of 12 and spent much of his youth in reform schools. After a stint in the army, he married and tried to settle into family life, working as a maintenance man. But beneath the surface, his compulsions were already taking shape. He began sneaking into women's apartments to fondle them while they slept, escaping before they woke. At the time, police had no idea who was responsible for the string of break-ins. They called him the Measuring Man, after reports that he would pretend to be a talent scout measuring women for modeling work. In the early 1960s, Boston was gripped by a new wave of terror. One by one, women across the city were found strangled in their own apartments. Most were single, living alone, and there were no signs of forced entry. The killer seemed to charm his way inside, then attack with chilling precision. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women were murdered in what became known as the Boston Strangler killings. The victims ranged in age from 19 to 85. Some had been sexually assaulted, others were arranged grotesquely after death. Panic swept through the city. Women double-locked their doors and hardware stores sold out of bolts and chains. When DeSalvo was arrested in 1964, it wasn't for murder but for another string of sexual assaults. He confessed to being the so-called Green Man, a serial rapist who had attacked dozens of women across Massachusetts. But while in custody, DeSalvo stunned investigators by also confessing to the Boston Strangler murders. His detailed descriptions matched many of the crime scenes, but not all. Some investigators doubted he could have committed every killing. There was no physical evidence linking him to most of the victims, and his confessions seemed inconsistent. Still, the public was desperate for closure, and authorities accepted his story. DeSalvo was never formally tried for the Boston Strangler murders. Instead, he was convicted of numerous sexual assaults and sentenced to life in prison. Behind bars, he became a notorious figure, both reviled and oddly admired for the scope of his crimes. In 1973, Albert DeSalvo was stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole State Prison. He was 42 years old. The identity of his killer remains unknown. Decades later, DNA evidence finally connected him definitively to one of the Boston Strangler victims, Mary Sullivan, confirming that at least part of his confession was true. But whether he acted alone, or if other killers were responsible for some of the murders, remains one of the greatest mysteries in American crime. The legend of the Boston Strangler endures, a story of fear, doubt, and the dark side of human nature. And while DeSalvo's case marked the end of one era of horror, another was already beginning, one that would spread terror across the highways of America, carried out by a man whose victims vanished without trace. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, the highway killer. As the legend of the Boston Strangler faded into history, another killer was preparing to leave her mark on America, this time on the open highways of Florida. Unlike most who came before her, this killer wasn't a man. She was a woman whose life of abuse and neglect erupted into violence that would shock the nation. Her name was Aileen Carol Wuornos, a woman the media called the highway killer. Aileen Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her childhood was marked by trauma from the very beginning. Her father, a convicted child molester, was imprisoned when she was born and later took his own life. Her mother abandoned her when she was only 4, leaving Aileen and her brother Keith to be raised by their grandparents. Life with them was no refuge. Her grandfather was an alcoholic known for violent rages, and her grandmother struggled with addiction. By the age of 11, Aileen was already drinking, smoking, and engaging in sexual activity, often in exchange for food, money, or cigarettes. She later claimed she was raped and beaten repeatedly throughout her youth. At 15, she became pregnant after being assaulted by a family friend. The baby was put up for adoption, and Aileen was expelled from her home soon after. Alone and destitute, she survived by hitchhiking and working as a prostitute, drifting from state to state. In her 20s, Wuornos racked up arrests for theft, forgery, and assault. She married briefly but quickly returned to life on the road. By the late 1980s, she had settled in Florida, living in cheap motels and supporting herself through prostitution along highways and truck stops. In late 1989, her life of survival turned deadly. On December 1st, the body of a man named Richard Mallory was found in a wooded area near Daytona Beach. He had been shot multiple times. Investigators initially suspected a robbery gone wrong, until more bodies began to appear. Over the next year, 6 more men were found dead across central Florida, each shot with the same .22 caliber pistol. Their vehicles were stolen and personal belongings were missing. The killer left little evidence behind, but seemed to target middle-aged men who had picked up a hitchhiker. Police eventually traced the crimes to Aileen Wuornos and her girlfriend, Tyria Moore. Security footage and pawn shop records tied them to several of the victims. When investigators located Moore, she agreed to help the police in exchange for immunity. Under their direction, she called Aileen and convinced her to confess. On January 9, 1991, Aileen Wuornos was arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County. At first, she denied everything, but when confronted with the evidence and feeling betrayed by Moore, she confessed. She claimed all 7 killings were acts of self-defense, saying each man had tried to assault or rape her during prostitution encounters. Her story divided public opinion. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer who murdered for money. Others viewed her as a victim of lifelong abuse who finally snapped. In 1992, Wuornos was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. During her trial, she often erupted in anger, shouting at the judge and accusing her lawyers of betrayal. Over the years, she granted interviews that revealed a fragile mind unraveling under pressure. Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, at Florida State Prison. Her final words were, "I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6th. Her story became a symbol of rage born from trauma, a tragic spiral from victim to murderer. It inspired documentaries, books, and the Oscar-winning film Monster, which portrayed her as both brutal and broken. Aileen Wuornos remains one of America's most infamous female killers, a woman shaped by pain, consumed by anger, and remembered as the face of vengeance on the open road. But while her story ended in death, another killer was already carving his own legacy of brutality across the American heartland. A man whose crimes would become a symbol of pure sadism. His name was Robert Berdella, the Butcher of Kansas City. As Aileen Wuornos faced her final days in a Florida prison, another story of horror was being retold hundreds of miles away. A story so grotesque, it shocked even hardened detectives. It came from the quiet suburbs of Kansas City, where a soft-spoken man ran a small business and seemed like any other neighbor. But inside his modest home, he created a private chamber of torture and death. His name was Robert Andrew Berdella, remembered now as the Butcher of Kansas City. Robert Berdella was born on January 31, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. From childhood, he was withdrawn and lonely. His father was a strict Catholic who demanded obedience, and his mother was passive, often ignoring the emotional chaos inside the home. Robert was intelligent and introverted, but he stood out, bullied for his glasses, his quiet manner, and his lack of confidence. He found refuge in reading and television, especially crime shows and horror films. At 16, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. The loss left Robert bitter and detached. By the time he entered college, he was already showing signs of cruelty. At the Kansas City Art Institute, he was known for experimenting with animal torture during photography projects, something that disturbed both classmates and teachers. He was expelled before graduating. After leaving school, Berdella stayed in Kansas City and opened a small shop in the flea market district called Bob's Bazaar Bazaar. He sold oddities, antiques, and occult items. To customers, he was eccentric but friendly, a harmless collector with a love for the unusual. But behind the friendly smile, Berdella's fantasies were becoming darker. By the mid-1980s, he began luring young men, often drifters or sex workers, to his home. There, he would drug them, tie them to his bed, and subject them to days of unimaginable torture. He meticulously documented everything in handwritten logs and photographs, treating his victims like living experiments. Between 1984 and 1987, Berdella kidnapped, tortured, and murdered at least 6 men. His methods were calculated: electric shocks, injections, and brutal assaults, all recorded in chilling detail. He kept souvenirs from each victim and disposed of the bodies in garbage bags, scattering them across Kansas City. For years, no one suspected him. He lived quietly, paid his taxes, and continued to run his shop. Then, in April 1988, his final victim escaped. A 22-year-old man named Chris Bryson broke free from Berdella's house, wearing only a dog collar and bleeding from his wrists. He ran to a neighbor's home and begged for help. When police entered Berdella's residence, what they found defied belief. Inside were torture devices, syringes, scalpels, Polaroid photos of victims, and detailed notes describing each act. It was a catalogue of cruelty, a diary of pain. Berdella was arrested immediately. During interrogation, he spoke calmly, insisting he had been conducting experiments on his captives. He claimed he never intended to kill them, but the evidence told a different story. Berdella was charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. In 1988, facing overwhelming proof, he confessed to 6 murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He showed no remorse, saying only that his victims had lost usefulness. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 1992, at the age of 43, Robert Berdella died of a heart attack in his cell. Some saw his death as too quick, too easy, for a man who had inflicted such terror. To this day, Berdella's crimes stand among the most sadistic in American history. The story of an unassuming man who turned his home into a house of horror. And while Kansas City tried to forget his name, another predator was already drawing attention. A killer who struck across multiple states, leaving behind riddles, symbols, and cryptic letters that taunted police for decades. He was known only by the name he gave himself, the Zodiac. As Kansas City reeled from the horrors of Robert Berdella, the West Coast still carried the ghost of another killer, one whose identity remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. He wasn't driven by money or lust, but by attention. He wanted the world to know his name, even if no one ever learned who he truly was. He called himself the Zodiac. The Zodiac killer's reign of terror began in Northern California during the late 1960s. His first confirmed attack took place on December 20, 1968, when two teenagers, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were shot and killed near Vallejo. Their murder seemed random, until 6 months later another couple was attacked in a similar fashion on a nearby road. This time, one victim survived. Michael Mageau, despite serious injuries, described the shooter as a man with a flashlight attached to his gun, calm, deliberate, and silent. Soon after, letters began arriving at local newspapers. Each letter was signed with a symbol, a circle with a cross through it, and included strange ciphers that the killer claimed would reveal his identity. One of the first messages began with the chilling line, "This is the Zodiac speaking." He demanded that his letters be printed on the front page of newspapers, or he would kill again. The messages were filled with arrogance, biblical references, and taunts toward the police. Some included details only the killer could have known. Throughout 1969 and 1970, the Zodiac continued to strike. His victims included young couples parked in remote areas, and later, a taxi driver shot dead in San Francisco. Eyewitnesses described the killer as a heavy-set white male in glasses, but his identity remained elusive. In one attack, he approached a couple picnicking near Lake Berryessa, wearing a hood marked with his signature symbol. He tied them up, stabbed them repeatedly, and then calmly walked away, leaving his mark on their car door, the circle and cross, along with the dates of his previous murders. The Zodiac didn't just kill. He performed for the public. His letters became more elaborate, filled with coded messages, threats against school buses, and commentary on the media's obsession with him. Police, journalists, and amateur codebreakers all tried to decipher his clues, some of which remain unsolved to this day. At one point, the killer claimed responsibility for 37 murders, though only 5 have been definitively linked to him. He seemed to enjoy the confusion, using imitation letters and false leads to keep his legend alive. Over the decades, dozens of suspects have been proposed, from Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted sex offender, to new names uncovered through modern DNA analysis. Yet none have ever been proven beyond doubt. Even the famous Zodiac ciphers, long believed unsolvable, were only partially decoded in recent years, revealing fragmented sentences but no clear identity. The Zodiac case remains one of the most haunting mysteries in American criminal history, a perfect storm of ego, intellect, and fear. He wanted immortality, and in a way he achieved it. Today, more than 50 years later, his letters are still studied by codebreakers and investigators around the world. Some believe he's still alive, others think he died long ago, taking his secrets with him. But what's certain is that the Zodiac changed the nature of crime in America, turning murder into media spectacle and fear into entertainment. He showed how terror could be amplified by the headlines, how mystery itself could be the weapon. And while the Zodiac faded into silence, another figure was already emerging. A man whose hunger for attention and cruelty would make him one of the most infamous killers of the 1970s. His name was David Parker Ray, known as the Toy Box Killer. As the mystery of the Zodiac continued to baffle investigators, another predator was operating far from the cities, hidden deep in the desert of New Mexico. His crimes weren't about chaos or fame. They were about control, the complete domination of his victims. He didn't just kill, he engineered pain. His name was David Parker Ray, remembered today as the Toy Box Killer. David Parker Ray was born on November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico. His father was an abusive man who drank heavily and beat both his wife and children. When his parents divorced, David was sent to live with his strict grandfather, a man who ruled the household with fear. As a boy, Ray was quiet and withdrawn. He was bullied at school and spent most of his time alone. When he was in his early teens, his father began giving him violent pornography, images of torture and bondage that would shape his fantasies for life. By the time he reached adulthood, those fantasies had become a dark obsession. After finishing school, Ray joined the army where he worked as a mechanic. When his service ended, he returned to New Mexico and settled near the small town of Truth or Consequences, where he lived in a trailer on the outskirts of the desert. He found work as a maintenance man for the local parks department, appearing polite and unremarkable to everyone who met him. No one suspected that inside his property, he was building a torture chamber. He called it the Toy Box. It was a soundproof trailer filled with devices he designed himself: whips, chains, clamps, surgical tools, even electric shock machines. Every detail was meticulously planned. He soundproofed the walls, installed mirrors so he could watch his victims from every angle, and mounted recording equipment to document their suffering. Ray's victims were mostly women he kidnapped, often sex workers or hitchhikers. He would drug them, chain them inside the trailer, and play a chilling cassette recording he'd made in advance. A calm, rehearsed speech explaining what was about to happen to them. He claimed to be part of a secret organization that abducted and tortured women, though no evidence of such a group was ever found. For years, women disappeared around the area, their cases largely ignored. Then in 1999, one of his captives managed to escape. Cynthia Vigil, a young woman he had abducted from a parking lot, managed to break free while Ray was at work. Naked, wearing only a metal collar and chain, she ran through the streets and flagged down a passing motorist. When police arrived at Ray's property, what they found was worse than anything they had imagined. Inside the toy box were surgical instruments, video cameras, written diaries describing hundreds of victims, and a collection of disturbing photographs. There was also a videotape of one of the assaults, confirming what investigators had feared, that many of the missing women in the region had ended up in that trailer. David Parker Ray was arrested along with his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, who had helped lure and torture victims. She later testified against him, describing in graphic detail the horrors that had taken place inside the toy box. Despite the evidence, prosecutors could only charge Ray with 3 kidnappings and 1 confirmed sexual assault. There were no surviving bodies to prove murder. He was convicted and sentenced to over 200 years in prison. David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in 2002, only 3 years after his arrest. He never showed remorse, and he never revealed how many victims there had been. Authorities estimate the number could be as high as 60. His trailer, the Toy Box, was eventually dismantled, its contents destroyed. But the legend of what happened inside it lives on as one of the most horrifying examples of premeditated cruelty in modern history. You've been watching Dead Curious. Where every story hides a darker truth, don't look away now. Hit like and subscribe and step deeper into the unknown.